Protect your DNA. BioPQQ can promote formation of new mitochondria. Infowarsstore.com.
On more serious news, we've got a former MI6 head saying that Europe faces a populist uprising over the migrant crisis. This is Richard Dearlove, formerly the head of the MI6. He says that if Europe cannot act together to persuade a significant majority of its citizens that it can gain control of its migratory crisis, then the EU will find itself at the mercy of a populist uprising, which is already stirring. He added that next month's vote on the UK leaving the European Union was, quote, the first roll of the dice in a bigger geopolitical game. And of course, certainly it is. I talked about this earlier today on the radio show in the fourth hour, the issues that are before the British people. And Boris Johnson has made it very clear. He went through and he talked about 8 different reasons for the British to leave the European Union. And we parallel that as to reasons why Texas should leave the United States. They point out top security experts in Germany told Chancellor Angela Merkel last October that the middle class in Germany was becoming radicalized as a result of her open borders migrant policy, and that they might have domestic disorder in Germany as well. You know, earlier today on the fourth hour, I talked about Boris Johnson, the former mayor of London, who favors Britain leaving the European Union. He laid out 8 reasons why Britain would be better off outside of the EU. And I thought it was very interesting because every one of those reasons had a much deeper parallel with Texas leaving the federal union that we have here. I said, you know, we ought to have, instead of just a Brexit, we ought to have an exit as well. But there are many European nations that would like to have a referendum as to whether or not they would stay in the European Union or whether they would leave. It hasn't taken very long for the European Union to become very dictatorial, very controlling, very regulatory of everything that is happening there. A lot of people are not happy with what has happened there. That's happened in just a couple of decades, what it took America to do in a couple of centuries. But of course, there are reasons for all of us to want to have a much closer, much more local government. This is one reason. The story today about the Supreme Court ruling on Obamacare's mandate for nuns to purchase insurance for birth control. Now, how ridiculous is that? And of course, the Supreme Court has essentially punted on the issue. The Little Sisters of the Poor is a 175-year-old religious order that ministers to the elderly and provides for their needs. The Obamacare mandate that non-church religious groups must provide contraceptive and abortion-inducing drugs at no cost to their employees went to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court has now sent it back to a lower court. Here's the issue. As we pointed out before, they kicked the idea back and forth, saying that, well, it would be unconstitutional if it were a mandate, but it's a tax, so it is constitutional. No, it's not. If it's a tax, they need to have an amendment like they did for the income tax. And I understand the people who have an issue with the way the amendment was passed. Just ignore that for the second and say they acknowledged that they needed to have an amendment to have an income tax, which means that they need to have an amendment to have any other direct taxes. They acknowledged that they needed to have an amendment to prohibit alcohol, which means that if they want to prohibit marijuana, where is the amendment to prohibit alcohol, to prohibit marijuana? And yet they continue to do this. And so what they do is they pull this up and they even say, is this a conflict with the congressional law, the Religious Freedom Restoration Act? No, it's a conflict with the First Amendment, which says Congress shall make no law, including Obamacare, that will take away religious freedom, the freedom to practice our religion freely. So this is a situation where the Supreme Court has overstepped its legal abilities to rule on this, and now they're pushing it back to lower courts. It just continues to go, and it's yet another reason why we need to push the idea of Texas. Texas getting out, maybe some other states will want to have a referendum as to whether or not they would leave as well. And of course, there was this article today, an update on Texas's move to have a gold depository here in the state. Remember, we reported on this about a year ago. It was June 15th last year. We had an article on Infowars.com from Zero Hedge. The writing is on the wall. Texas pulls $1 billion in gold from the New York Fed and makes it non-confiscatable. They said the lack of faith in central bank trustworthiness is spreading. And of course, again, we see this not only here in America, not only in Texas, but we see it happening first in Europe. They say first in Germany, then in Holland, then in Austria. They all wanted to get their gold back from the United States depositories. And of course, what did the depositories tell them, these trustworthy depositories? We'll have to think about it. We'll get it back to you maybe 2 years from now. We'll give you some of that back. We're not sure. So now Texas, that was a year ago, enacted a bill to repatriate $1 billion of gold from the New York Fed's vaults to the newly established state gold bullion depository. And it included a section that would prevent forced seizure from the federal government. At the time, Texas Governor Greg Abbott signed the bill into law as June 12th. It allowed Texans to build a gold and silver depository, bullion depository. And they said at the time there were two reasons for them to do this. One involved distrust in the current storage system. The other was the threat of the paper money system as a whole. And I would say there was also a third issue, and that is the dishonest, morally and financially bankrupt federal government and the private Federal Reserve. And at the time, it was interesting because we had a New York lawyer immediately come out and write an op-ed piece attacking the idea that Texas would have such an effrontery that they would not trust the Federal Reserve or the federal government. This is New York Attorney Joe Patrice, who wrote a blog in Above the Law. He condemned Texas's creation of a gold bank. He said, you may be wondering why any state would want to build a gold repository when the federal government already provides one that's so secure, so large, that most American allies keep their reserves there as well, ignoring what I just told you, the fact that we have many American allies who want to get their gold back, and they're very concerned that it's not forthcoming. They're very concerned about whether or not it's still there. He says it quickly becomes apparent in this article that we had a year ago that the lawyer was mad that anyone would do anything to suggest that we should have less than 100% faith in anything that the government does. But they pointed out at the time, even Mother Jones admitted that Texas pays more in taxes than it gets. And I mentioned this today earlier. You know, when Boris Johnson was giving his 8 reasons for Britain to leave the EU, he said, hey, that would give us 350 million pounds per week, which is about $500,000 per week for Britons to spend as Britons saw fit. Well, guess what it is with Texas? We send 3 times that amount of money to the federal government, and that's the net, the difference between what they send to Texas and what we send to them. $1.5 billion per week. What are we getting for it? Nothing but continual meddling. And so when they won't leave us alone, we ought to leave them. And it's akin to this type of pushback that we see from this New York lawyer when he says, we hate those secessionists. We'll never allow them to leave. We demand that they be united to us forever. And so now what we saw this last weekend was not only a move to push for Texas secession that came within 2 votes of going before the floor of the 4,000 people on the floor to vote for it, but now we've seen a company here in Texas propose to set up a depository and do it without taxpayer money, Texas style. That's a great idea.
In the past decade, we have witnessed unparalleled scientific discoveries in the area of health. But no one has put together a formula that focuses directly on brain health, nerve growth factors, and optimizing your cellular energy at the same time. DNA Force is one of the most expensive formulas to produce. Some of the ingredients in DNA Force are $12,000 a kilogram. We are using the coveted, patented, only American source of PQQ, CoQ10, and more. You want the best that's out there at the lowest price anywhere? Well, we're bringing you a total win-win. The ultimate value, cutting-edge, trailblazing game changer that also supports the InfoWar. We have produced a limited run of DNA Force, and it will take up to 12 weeks to produce more once we sell out. Secure your DNA Force today at InfoWarsLife.com or call toll-free 888-253-3139.